Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming into the museum on this sunny but chilly day. This is the fourth of our World War I lectures that we've been doing in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of World War I. I just want to, before we bring up today's historian, I just want to thank our funders who have been very generous to us. We've received funding from the New Jersey Historical Commission, as well as the Gilda Lehrman Institute of American History, the Library of America, and the National Endowment of the Humanities. Just let me say a little bit about today's historian. Jeffrey Sammons is a professor of history at NYU. He's the author of Harlem's Rattlers and the Great War, the Undaunted 369th Regiment, which we have for sale in the gift shop. He also serves on the advisory panel of the World War I Centennial Commission. He's a New Jersey native and a graduate of Rutgers University. And so let's welcome Professor Jeffrey Sammons. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, and thanks to the administration and staff of the museum for having me, and thanks to you for coming out on this beautiful fall day to hear about the 369th. Yes, I'm a South Jersey guy, far South Jersey, Cumberland County, Bridgeton. So today we're going to hear about a regiment that's often known as Harlem Hellfighters, and that's the most popular name of the 15th New York National Guard / 369th Regiment. And we'll talk about those numbers in a bit, enumeration, but we call them Harlem's Rattlers for we think a very good reason, we being my co-author and I, John Morrow Jr. As you can see there's a rattler that is prominent in that commemorative history that was given to Benjamin O. Davis Sr. in 1939. And Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was the first black commander of the 15/369th Regiment, and it didn't happen until 1938. And the regiment was in existence from 1916, so 22 years before the regiment would get its first black commander. We'll talk about that as well. But you can see there the regiment was on the front for 191 days, which was the longest of any American unit in World War I. On the front, never lost a foot of ground that it had captured, didn't lose a man to capture. 174 individuals received the Croix de Guerre, which is the French Cross of War, and the entire regiment also received it. You also see that there were 4 silver bands that the regiment received for 4 major engagements that it was in during the war. So it had a fantastic record in France. Unfortunately, the Americans authorities did not recognize it to the extent that the French did, which is another thing that we'll talk about in a minute. But I also want to say something about how popular this regiment is before telling you how it came about. And that will take us to a 1943 film. You ready, Eileen? It's Stormy Weather, starring Bill Bojangles Robinson, Lena Horne, Cab Calloway, Dooley Wilson, Fats Waller, Katherine Dunham, the greatest talent in Black Hollywood. Let's start, and I'll...
Rang, tang, tang. Rang, tang, tang. Oh, rang, tang, tang. Oh, rang, tang, tang. Look at this.
Read it, Uncle Bill. What does it say, Uncle Bill?
Why, it said, Dear Bill, Jim Europe would have been proud of you. Signed, Extra Major Noble Sissom.
Who's Jim Europe, Uncle Bill?
Jim Europe? Why, he had the greatest band in the world, attached to the 15th Regiment. Didn't I never tell you that?
No, Uncle Bill.
Why, we was under fire for 191 days straight. Yes, sir. And our regiment was decorated with the quarter gear.
You don't say, Uncle Bill.
Why, children, I remember when we come back from France in 1918, the flags was flying, people were cheering.
Book of telephone numbers I won from Joe. Boy, I'm going to promote us a couple of gals for the ball tonight.
How do you spell us?
U.S.
You leave off the S and worry about you. Every time you start the promoting, that spells trouble.
There you go again.
Didn't you go to the ball that night?
We sure did.
And did Gay promote your girl, Uncle Bill?
No, he didn't. But he promoted everything else. A girl for himself, a big limousine, and a chauffeur. We sure went there in style.
This must be General Pershing coming. Can't be because General Pershing's a blind.
Well, boy, here we are, and I'm going to Lindy hop down.
Boy, I'm going to Carol. Come on, honey. Come back at 12, my man. Come on. Yes, you. Come, Dick, what you want this time? What you keep on calling me?
I'm sorry, Gabe, I can't come back and get you.
Why?
The boss wants to use the car himself.
But Cousin Jake, how we gonna get home?
How'd you get up time from the ship this morning?
Walk.
But there's your answer.
So, here's a 1943 Hollywood film set in 1919, although the Bill Robinson character, Bill Williamson, says it was 1918. And for a while, I wondered if that was just a dating mistake, but I'm not sure. It might be something deeper about that, because 1919 was a year that a lot of, I think, authorities didn't want to remember. That is the year of the Red Summer and the Red Scare. And the Red Summer referring to race riots across the nation after the war, and of course Red Scare referring to the communist threat. And in 1943, in the middle of the war, we had a riot in Detroit and also a Zoot Suit riot in Los Angeles. So one of the things that filmmakers and government censors certainly didn't want to remind people of were race riots. It's interesting, too, that Robinson didn't refer to the unit by its designation that it had in the war, the 369th. Something else, I don't know if you picked up on this, but the two young fellows are talking about who's arriving in this limousine, and one of them says it must be General Pershing, and the other says it can't be because Pershing's a blonde. Now, we know that Pershing is anything but blonde. He's dark-haired and also, you know, he grays, but he's also known as Blackjack. So that's the closest that this film gets to mentioning white people, or race for that matter. And the film is an example of it goes on to show how happy blacks are in a segregated America, interestingly enough. And of course, the military is segregated in 1943. It will not integrate on the ground until the Korean War in 1951, despite Truman's executive order in 1948 to integrate the armed forces. all right? And now the armed forces, one of the most integrated institutions in all of America. And in fact, I'll be at an event on November 11th at the new museum in Washington, D.C., the National African American Museum of History and Culture. And one of the panels will have 2 4-star generals, black 4-star generals on it. So this film was designed to, improve the morale of black people. The NAACP had been pushing Hollywood and the government for better images of black people on screen. There's still too much like Birth of a Nation, which is a 1915 film by David Wark Griffith that establishes or really reinforces all kinds of negative stereotypes of blacks. And this was supposed to be seen as progress in terms of, and you have to see the rest of the film to see for yourselves whether you judge it to be a sign of progress or not. So, how do we get to the 15th, 369th as a New York National Guard regiment? Well, it's a long and tortuous struggle to, or road to that reality. Of course, blacks had been involved in wars, from the French and Indian War, the Revolutionary War, and War of 1812, the Civil War. And through the Civil War, there was not a black regiment of militia or National Guard recognized officially by the state of New York. There were 3 regiments of infantry that fought in the Civil War from New York, but they were privately raised and funded, largely by the Union League Club of New York, which was dedicated to the Union and was a pro-Lincoln organization, still in existence today, still Republican, but not the party of Lincoln Republican. They also were very much involved in the protection of blacks during and after the draft riots of 1863. So it's in New York City, in the middle of the Civil War, that we have a riot that was targeting black people. Just to give you some sense of what New York was like, in 1790, and I'll back up a minute, New York had more slaves than any other city in the United States, with the exception of Charleston. Right? And New York was heavily implicated in the slave trade and in manufacturing of goods that were used by slaveholders. So New York played a very important role in the institution of slavery. It did not abolish slavery until 1830 through a gradual abolition act. How many saw the film Lincoln? Who was the sort of the arch enemy of Thaddeus Stevens in the film, the gentleman who was pushing for the ratification of the 13th Amendment to end slavery? It was Fernando Wood, a Democrat from New York who had been a mayor and was in the film a congressman. So blacks kept pushing for a National Guard unit. They did so in the 1870s and 1880s, and in fact, Harrigan and Hart, these playwrights, theater guys, produced a series called Mulligan Guards. And this was about a dysfunctional, fictional Irish-American militia unit in New York. And its foil was the Skidmore Guard, which was this real militia unit that blacks had formed, hoping to become recognized by the state authorities. And they were made the butt of all kinds of jokes. And one of the most famous ones is that Mulligan Guard and Skidmore Guard met in the same facility, the same building one day. And the Skidmore Guard had the upper floor. And they were bragging that now we're above the Irish. Well, lo and behold, they're dancing, jumping, shouting, and the floor collapsed, so no longer above the Irish. So this is the kind of thing that was being done with blacks who wanted to prove that they were worthy to be a part of New York's military institutions. One could not have full citizenship without participation in that kind of institution. But there was a law passed by the state legislature saying that no unit could march with weapons unless it was recognized by the state. Today we would call that a catch-22, so these guys couldn't march because they weren't recognized, and they weren't going to be recognized, so they couldn't really march. And what kind of military unit would it be not to have weapons, all right? So then we have the Spanish-American War. And once again, blacks say that we would like to have our own military unit to represent us, to make us, once again, full citizens in the state. Once again, they're denied. And of course, this issue is a very political one. And on one side, we have the Democrats and the regular Democratic Party, which is known as Tammany Hall, and on the other, the Republican Party. And of course, blacks were partial to the party of Lincoln. They identified him with the abolition of slavery and for rights for black people. But Tammany Hall would say that the Republicans are denying blacks the right to have a military institution of their own. And then Republicans would blame Tammany Hall. And blacks had very little political representation to make a difference in New York at this time. And in fact, there was this auxiliary organization called the United Colored Democracy that was a wing of Tammany Hall that was organized at the city level. Nothing got done at the city level. It was all at the ward and precinct level. If you wanted to play real politics in New York and get things done, that's where they were done, and blacks didn't have any representation. Well, there's something happening too. While blacks are fighting in New York for National Guard recognition, there's something happening in Chicago. And Chicago and New York were sort of vying with one another to see who would be named the black, or could claim the title of Black Metropolis. And one of the things that Chicago and Illinois had was a National Guard unit. It was the 8th Illinois, and it was manned by blacks from the top down. It had all black officers and all black men, and from colonel down to buck private, all black. And this was a source of envy and resentment for New Yorkers who believed that they were number one among the cities in terms of black progress. So there was a call for civic development in New York, and this call was finally heeded in 1910 in the form of an organization called the Equity Congress of Greater New York. And it was a multi-party, nonpartisan group, and they were dedicated to the involvement of blacks in politics, in the economic life of New York in integral and meaningful ways. They also called for election of blacks to political office, for the integration of the fire department and the police department in New York. New York did not have its first black policeman until 1911, Samuel J. Battle, and he was the only black policeman for some time to come. As a matter of fact, the woman who will become the president of the 15th Women's Auxiliary was Susan Elizabeth Frazier. She is the first black to teach in an integrated school in New York, and that did not happen until 1893, after protracted legal battles. So New York isn't the kind of place that we might think of New York as today, although I understand that New York school segregation resembles that of what we would associate with the South. So in any event, this Equity Congress is also dedicated to the establishment of a Black National Guard unit. So it's formed in 1910. The leader of this movement will be a man by the name of Charles Ward Fillmore, who hails from Ohio. He was a major in the Ohio National Guard, was broken down to a lieutenant over some conflict with the governor of Ohio. He would fight in the Spanish, or serve in the Spanish-American War with a unit known as the Colored Immunes. What's that mean? Well, there was this notion among the military that blacks were immune or resistant to tropical diseases, such as yellow fever and malaria. So a lot of these black soldiers of the colored immune units were used as nurses to treat those soldiers who had contracted these tropical diseases. And of course, blacks died too. And in fact, Charles Ward Fillmore contracted malaria, but obviously survived it. And there are all kinds of examples of blacks having succumbed to yellow fever before the Spanish-American War in the American South. And this would be something that Jacques Barzun refers to as a superstition that has some kind of, scientific, element to it. And what does Jacques Barzun say a superstition is? It's an idea that stands over facts. You can have all these facts out there that disprove the superstition or the myth, as it were, but the myth stands. And this is often what happened to blacks. And in fact, after the war, we would see this very kind of notion put forth in a 1925 study by the Army War College about black capacity, black tendencies, black traits, black characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so Fillmore and others are pushing hard for the acceptance of a Black National Guard unit in New York. The political football game continues. There are there's legislation from the Assembly that's not passed by the Senate, or it gets to the governor and it's knocked down by the governor, or the National Guard leadership finds a way of interfering so that there's no successful legislation. Finally, in 1913, with a Democratic governor who was anti-Tammany Hall, and in fact he would be impeached later, William Sulcer, there is a law that is passed authorizing the institution or organization, establishment of a colored regiment of infantry in the New York National Guard, and it was supposed to have been done in 90 days. Well, that was 1913. You might have heard me say that the regiment wasn't established until 1916, so 90 days became 3 years. And once again, the National Guard leadership, Major John F. O'Ryan, would do everything in his power to see that the regiment did not become a reality. And one of the ways in which they did this was to deny the regiment an armory, so it's very difficult to raise an army, a unit, a military unit without, and to train it without an armory. Two, they failed almost all of the men, candidates for officer. And once again, there would be no regiment without officers. So in 1914, Charles Seymour Whitman is elected governor of New York. He's a Republican. He had also been secretary of the Union League Club. He was still a member of the Union League Club. He tried to actually make the law more than the dead letter that it had become, and he was blocked by the authorities in Washington. The relationship between National Guards of the state and the federal government had become much closer by 1914, and he was told that you have surplus infantry in New York. There's no way that we're going to approve another infantry unit. As a matter of fact, John F. O'Ryan had told Charles Will Ward Fillmore that we're happy to have you guys as maybe in the Quartermaster Corps or service of supply, labor troops, sanitation, that type of thing. And he says, you know, you would be able to wear fancy uniforms. And Fillmore said, we're not interested in pretty suits. We're interested in positions of honor and trust. We do not want to become, your servants in the National Guard. So, interesting thing happens. Of course, we're starting by 1916 to see that we might actually be fighting this really nasty, ugly war in Europe. In 1915, May of 1915, the Lusitania is sunk by a German U-boat, right? 128 Americans die, I believe, and over 1,200 civilians died. That incident would be remembered for quite some time and would become part of a rallying cry to deal with the so-called Huns. And there were other things going on as well, and then of course eventually we have some more sinkings of passenger ships or merchant ships, and the famous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany was urging Mexico to strike out against us. And that brings me to the story that I want to talk to you about. So there was also at the same time these people who were really big on preparedness. Most of them were Republicans. Theodore Roosevelt was a big preparedness man. So was General Leonard Wood. And there was this Plattsburgh movement in which young businessmen, college men, were being given military training. There was this feeling that American men were weak, soft, and military discipline would be very good for them. So there's a lot of and we haven't talked about the financiers who were very interested in trade with the Allies in World War I, and were doing all that they could to, make sure that the German, unrestricted submarine warfare wasn't successful, that the British blockade stayed in place, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, there was somewhat of an affinity toward, England or Great Britain, and less so toward Germany. And interestingly, the Hoboken Museum website talks about the difficulties that German Americans had in Hoboken and they would have in other places in the United States as well. And Wilson really pinpointed the threat of hyphenated Americans, German Americans being just one of those groups. Of course, Irish Americans were not happy about Britain either. So there were those kinds of issues. So in 1916, there's something going on the Mexican border. And there's some incursions by a person that's called a bandit by some, but I would call him more of a revolutionary, Francisco Pancho Villa, right? So he's been crossing the border into New Mexico, et cetera, and doing some damage there. So, and of course, Americans had gone into Veracruz, et cetera, had been involved in the affairs of Mexico and supporting various leaders of Mexico against the will of the Mexican people. And Woodrow Wilson basically federalizes the National Guard, which he can do in 1916, and sends General John J. Pershing to the Mexican border to deal with Pancho Villa in what is known as a Punitive Raid. It wasn't a declaration of war. Well, it wasn't successful for a variety of reasons. Not enough resources were committed. The Mexican government was not, cooperative, et cetera, et cetera. The troops were bad as well, many of them National Guardsmen, and the National Guard was notoriously deficient as an effective military institution. And in fact, one of the reasons why it was so difficult to get the state to recognize a black National Guard unit is that the National Guard was as much a social institution as it was a military institution. But one of the things that happens is that because New Yorkers are sent to the Mexican border, New York Guardsmen, there is a manpower shortage in New York. Governor Whitman sees that the War Department can no longer say that there's surplus infantry, so he takes the opportunity to say that I will put into effect the legislation that was passed in 1913 to establish a black National Guard unit in New York. Well, there was jubilation, et cetera, among blacks. Finally, our day had come, they were saying. Well, there were strings attached. Remember what I said about the 8th Illinois in Chicago? It was officered by blacks from the top down. There would be no black New York National Guard unit unless it had a white commander. And General Orion believed that there weren't going to be any black officers in the unit when the new standards were applied and they had to take the new federal exam. So we have William Hayward, who's also a member of the Union League Club, a very close friend of Charles Seymour Whitman, and Hayward's father had been a senator from Nebraska. Hayward had helped run Whitman's campaign for governor. He was public service commissioner. He was a lawyer, outstanding athlete, very handsome gentleman. And he told blacks who were very skeptical about a white commander of this unit that he was there to judge people not on the basis of color, but on the basis of their ability. And he believed that black citizens deserved the kind of fairness that he was willing to, or fair consideration that he would give to them. So the unit is organized finally in 1916, June 29th, 1916. It becomes an official part of the New York National Guard in theory, in principle, technically, but not in actuality. It really becomes a detached appendage of the New York National Guard. It's not, the regiment is not brigaded. That means it's not connected to another regiment to form a brigade. So no regiment can operate on its own. You need brigade, then you have division. It doesn't train with what was then the 6th New York National Guard Division, which becomes the 27th in World War I. The only time they were kind of together was in Spartanburg, South Carolina, of all places, where the regiment was sent to train in late September, October of 1917. And, well, Northern blacks, Southern whites, that's a pretty volatile mix. James Reese Yorp sends Noble Sissel into, and we saw those names in the film. James Reese Yorp is a famous bandmaster. He was the director of the Irene and Vernon Castle dance team, is considered to be the creator of the Foxtrot, led the Clef Club Orchestra in New York, fantastic musician, fantastic composer, organizer, and will eventually be considered as the person most responsible for introducing live jazz to Europe in the form of his military band, which we also saw mentioned in the film. And Noble Sissel started out as the drum major of the 15th New York National Guard, and Noble Sissel would, after the war, team up with U.B. Blake, and they were the creators of Bubbling Brown Sugar, which just left Broadway. A revival of it left a few weeks ago. So Yorp is an officer in the regiment, along with Fillmore, who becomes a captain. Napoleon Bonaparte Marshall is also a captain, and then there are 2 other lieutenants. Yorp was a lieutenant. So when the regiment goes overseas, it will have only 5 blacks out of an officer cadre of 55, right? Better than none, but certainly not what black New Yorkers had wanted. And as a matter of fact, the officer issue will continue through the war and after the war. In fact, during the war, Pershing would pull out all of the black officers, with the exception of Yorp, who was leading the band and was indispensable to it. As I said before, the regiment would not get its first black commander until 1938, and that's someone from the regular Army. And in fact, he was moved out quickly, that is Benjamin O. Davis Sr., because he became the first black general in the United States Army in 1940. So the regiment is pulled out of Spartanburg for fear of, and I mentioned, and I get back to my point, James Reese Yorp sent Noble Sissel into a hotel to get a newspaper. The owner of the hotel objected to this black man wearing a military cap in his hotel. He knocked his hat off, kicked Sissel out the door, and this almost created a race riot there in Spartanburg. And the authorities decided that there was going to be, if they didn't get these men out of the South, there would be a race war in the U.S., and they would rather have them in France. The question was, well, how would they be used in France? Because they were going to be sent. But that takes us directly to Hoboken. So the regiment is scheduled to depart on November 11th, 1917. The regiment had been transported by the Grand Republic ship to the pier at Hoboken. Hoboken, of course, was the major port of embarkation for American troops in World War I. And in Hoboken, the men boarded the U.S. transport Pocahontas on November 12, 1917. It sailed for France on the Pocahontas on November 12, 1917, but about 150 miles out from Sandy Hook, one of the engine rods broke, and the Pocahontas returned to pier at Hoboken on November 15, 1917. The regiment disembarked from the Pocahontas at Hoboken, proceeded by railroad to Camp Merritt, which is near Tenafly, New Jersey, on Friday, November 16, 1917. And this experience in Camp Merritt would almost destroy the regiment. There were other military units at Camp Merritt. White officers were treating, from these units, were treating the black soldiers of the 15th very badly. Also, there was a murder by one of the members of the regiment by another member in Camp Merritt, which also threatened to tear the regiment apart. In addition, there was all kinds of AWOL, desertion, etc. So there's a second embarkation. The unit departed from Camp Merritt, re-embarked upon the U.S. Pocahontas Monday, December 3rd, 1917. And about noon of December 3rd, 1917, shortly before sailing, there was a fire aboard the Pocahontas. The troops were either held on board or kept close by, and for 9 days before the ship could be repaired. All right, so on December 12th, the ship departs again from Hoboken, and on December 15th, there is a blizzard off the coast of New Jersey, and the ship didn't hook up with the convoy, and one of the American ships lost in the storm, actually was a British oil tanker, drifted and collided with the Pocahontas, all right? And the ship suffered damages to its superstructure and freeboard on the starboard bow. Repairs were, they said, we're not going back. We can't go back. Repairs were accomplished at anchor near Sandy Hook by the men of the 369th, as well as some ship's carpenters who were on board. And on December 14, 1917, the Pocahontas passed Sandy Hook successfully and proceeded upon its voyage, and it arrived around December 30th in France, safely at Brest, December 27, 1917. So you see the rattlesnake there. That is a book cover by Arthur W. Little, who was a major in the regiment. And after the war, he would publish, actually it was not until 1936, From Harlem to the Rhine. And you see what's on the cover of his book is the rattlesnake, once again reinforcing, I think, the correctness of our decision to call them the Rattlers. And in fact, they were given this designation, I mean, they had adopted this. I wasn't sure when it happened. And of course, it refers to the rattlesnake on the Gadsden flag, "Don't tread on me," right? And they actually adopted the icon during the war. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, but the French did not put unit numbers or names on their transport vehicles. They put these, symbols. And so the commander said, we should do a similar thing, and said, well, what's, quintessentially American? And it's the rattlesnake. So that's how that happened with all of its meaning. Next slide. Yes. Now, this is Burt Williams. I know you're not used to seeing Burt Williams like this. But Burt Williams was a recruiter for the 15th New York National Guard. He did not go overseas, and his tenure with it was very short. But supposedly, he had been an officer in the California National Guard. That's Charles Young, who should have become the first black general in the American Army. And people wanted Young to be the commander of the 15th New York National Guard. When I say people, W.E.B. Du Bois, Oswald Garrison Villard, who were both friendly with Charles Young, wanted him to become the commander, but the U.S. military wasn't having that. And in fact, Charles Young would be deactivated in the war because if he had stayed in, he would have had to have been promoted. He was considered to be of ill health. Charles Young rode a horse from Ohio to Washington, D.C. In fact, he didn't ride it all the way. He alternated between riding and walking to give the horse a rest. And when he arrived in Washington, D.C., he was told by the authorities that you haven't proved that you're healthy, only that the horse is healthy. All right, so he was deactivated until the war was over, reactivated, sent to Africa, and he had served these kinds of hazardous duty stints before in Haiti, and had been in Africa before. And in fact, his first time in Africa, he got something called black water fever, which is a form of malaria that turns the urine, like the color, it's really almost black. And it's almost always fatal. He survived it only to go back and die of some tropical disease in Africa after the war. And he's a third black graduate of West Point. And that was in 1880-something. He would not become, there would not be another black graduate of the United States Military Academy until 1936. And that was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the son of Benjamin O. Davis, Sr. And during his tenure at West Point, no one talked to him. The only time he was talked to was in class or if he was given orders, et cetera. It was never any kind of social occasion in which, and this happened to Charles Young as well. All right, next slide, please. All right, so we see the 15th with the flag, training. This is the guy who killed the other soldier. He's a story unto himself, chapter 6 of the book. Baldo Schita. Where he got that name, I don't know. And who he really was, I don't know. He claimed to be an African who had been a British subject, et cetera. I think he's from Kentucky or Tennessee, but he was a fantastic impersonator and con man. Next, please. Okay, so there we have blacks in the trenches, and that gets me to the next point. So when they go to Europe, they're only a regiment. A regiment cannot fight on his own, as I pointed out before. So they're given labor duties, and they're actually supposed to be part of a provisional 93rd Division, which would also include the 8th Illinois, as well as a 371st Regiment of regular Army soldiers, and a 372nd, which was a composite of National Guard units and some regular Army. But that unit was not over there yet. These guys arrived before any of the other black combat troops arrived. So they were used as stevedores, bridge builders, canal diggers, et cetera. So Hayward is saying, my men were trained to be fighting soldiers. They're combat troops. He's pleading with Pershing. Falls on deaf ears. It is the French who were desperate for reinforcements, for manpower, who plead with Pershing to give them troops. In fact, they wanted white troops, but the United States Army was determined to fight independently of the Allies. Now, Pershing eventually relented and gave some National Guard units, white ones, to the British and the Australians. But to the French, he never gave any white units. So finally, after much back and forth with the War Department and the French leadership, Pershing said, I'll give you this 15th New York National Guard, which had already, the men didn't know it, but they had been renamed the 369th. They learned this from the French. So in March of 1918, the 369th is an integral part of the French 4th Army, 161st Division. The French had complete military control over them, but the United States maintained administrative control. By April, they were on the front. So after 1 month with the French, this unit was, and that's why we have that 191 days, longer than any other American unit. So one of the great heroes of the war is Henry Johnson. Henry Johnson is from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and he lived in Albany, New York when he enters the 15th New York National Guard, and a participant in the action that would eventually result in a Medal of Honor for Henry Johnson is Needham Roberts of Trenton, New Jersey, who also spent the last years of his life in Newark. So let me read you what Henry Johnson did. And in fact, Henry Johnson received the Croix de Guerre with Palm, which is the highest honor that an enlisted man can get from the French. He did not receive a single American honor. He had a chevron, which was a wound chevron, and he had some kind of marksmanship medal or badge. But the Purple Heart actually was not reinstated until after World War I, and men had to apply for it. So Henry Johnson would not get a Purple Heart until 1996 during the Clinton administration. He received a Distinguished Service Cross in 2003, which was a cynical attempt by the Department of Defense to take the wind out of the sails of the movement to get Henry Johnson a Medal of Honor, which did not come until June 2nd, 2015. And the movement had been in place since the 1980s. Private Henry Johnson distinguished himself, and he would be promoted to sergeant, but when he was engaged in his actions, he was a private, by extraordinary acts of heroism at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a member of Company C, 369th Infantry, 93rd Division, American Expeditionary Forces on May 15, 1918. During combat operations against the enemy on the front lines of the Western Front in France, in the early morning hours, Private Johnson and another soldier, and that's Needham Roberts, were on sentry duty at a forward outpost when they received a surprise attack from a German raiding party consisting of at least 12 soldiers. While under intense enemy fire, and despite receiving significant wounds, Private Johnson mounted a brave retaliation resulting in several enemy casualties. When his fellow soldier was badly wounded and being carried away by the enemy, Private Johnson exposed himself to grave danger by advancing from his position to engage the two enemy captors in hand-to-hand combat. Wielding only a knife and gravely wounded himself, Private Johnson continued fighting, defeating the two captors and rescuing the wounded soldier. Displaying great courage, he continued to hold back the larger enemy force until the defeated enemy retreated leaving behind a large cache of weapons and equipment and providing valuable intelligence. Without Private Johnson's quick actions at the outposts, without abandoning valuable intelligence, Private Johnson's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect great credit upon himself and his company, his regiment, and the United States Army. So, over here we have someone who, James Vandersea, tried to tell us were Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts. They, as you can clearly see, were not. All right. So why don't we tell what happens to the regiment when it returns by showing the victory parade that we started seeing in the film Stormy Weather. This is silent, of course, but this is February 17, 1919. Where is it? It's on Fifth Avenue. They're marching up Fifth Avenue. They went from Madison Park all the way up to Harlem.
Looks like it's the library on the side.
Oh, they started before that. They're marching past the library uptown. And they're marching in a French formation of 16 men across, the phalanx of 16, which had been unseen in an American military unit. February 17, 1919.
Can I ask how many people in a regiment?
Well, that's a very good question. The regiment, Americans thought that war strength was 2,000 men in a regiment. It's actually closer to like 3,700. So at their highest level, they would have been around 3,700 with all the units that are required of a regiment. Actually, the authorities wanted the original 15th to march, would have been maybe 1,000 men, because they didn't want this spectacle of these, disciplined, trained to kill black soldiers. And I'm looking for something now to show you what the press wrote about that.
Was that FDR or Governor Smith?
Excuse me? Yeah. Was it who?
FDR?
I don't think so. It could have been, but he was, he's never mentioned as having been in attendance. He would have been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the war.
Were these just New York troops or troops from all over the country?
Well, the 2,000 base was largely from New York. Some were from other places, but the core was from New York. But once they're overseas, they have replacement troops that are coming in from all over to get them up to that war strength. That's Henry Johnson.
Oh, holding the...
Yes, with the flowers, yes.
Do you think that's more up in Harlem now?
Yes,
Because
they
they're
are
black
Harlem
people
town,
in the...
Well, They dispersed when they were in, they widened the ranks. I don't think they're in Harlem yet, but. What was the feeling of the French army wanting soldiers? And they were not going to get white soldiers. What were their feelings towards the soldiers? Were they accepting of it? Did they just understood this is the way it was? Or, I'm curious about how they were feeling having African-American soldiers as part of the army and exchange with them. Well, the French were used to having black soldiers. They used their the colonial troops from Senegal, Morocco, Algeria, and often they misused them as shock troops. They saw these black soldiers as more American than black in a way, that they were cosmopolitan, not only American, but from the American cosmopolitan capital, as it were, right? So they were most concerned about whether these men could fight or not. As a matter of fact, the Americans started interfering. There's a famous memorandum called the Leonard Memorandum that was actually authored by a French attaché to AEF headquarters, but it was at the instigation of the Americans to say that the French did not want their troops to socialize with the black Americans, and they had to pull back from that. One of the things that happens is, too, that Pershing tries to take these guys away from the French to make them labor troops after they had served in combat. There were some French officers who had these, they weren't immune to, racist notions and all of that, and some of them were highly critical, especially of black officers. But the soldiers and the leaders of the 369th say that the French were tremendously welcoming and cordial to them. So that wasn't an issue for the French. And they fought Pershing not to let them go, to give you some sense of how valuable they saw them as being. So, all right, so that parade almost didn't happen. It was a kind of almost a spur of the moment thing. And there's an organization called the Rocky Mountain Club, which was a group of mining engineers. Herbert Hoover was one of the leading members of the Rocky Mountain Club. And some people in the 369th had alliances with the Rocky Mountain Club. They were able to say to the War Department, look, our guy Herbert Hoover did a lot for you with the Belgian Relief Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And they relented. First, they said, we'll let the original 15th march. Hayward said all these guys fought, all of them should be able to march, and that's why you have the size of the unit that you have. But the press coverage of it was really interesting. It was mocking in some ways, but it also showed how afraid they were of these men. Described them as 7 feet tall, their bayonets glistening in the sun, their boots making this, like a tearing of sheets on the pavement. And David Levering Lewis would say that that march on February 17, 1919, ushered in the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance and the New Negro. And interestingly, one of the key figures of the Harlem Renaissance was this guy named Andy Razoff. Could we move it forward back to the stills, Eileen? And he wrote 2 poems about blacks in World War I. And one was a riff on John McCrae's In Flanders Field. But this one had, a racial dimension to it. In any event, and that monument, by the way, was not erected until 1997. They had no monument for the regiment because Pershing changed the rules. He was the head of the American Battle Monuments Commission after the war, and he decided that there could be no monument for a unit smaller than a division. So the 369th was a regiment, so there was not, so this is private, sponsored by some Americans and the French. The American Battle Monuments Commission has nothing to do with it, as a matter of fact.
Purposely, he made it to make it to division because of?
I think it was a factor. He said there was a proliferation of monuments and they weren't up to, the standards that they should be, and we need to set a limit. And but I think it had something to do with it. It's in Seychelles, which is near the Argonne Forest, Champagne-Marne area of France. I've actually been. Could we move it some? And this is interesting. This is Hartmann's Villerskoff in the Vosges, which is near the Alsace area of France. And so that's near the Rhine. And the regiment has a plaque in that monument to its service there in that area. But I'm still trying to get to the poem in Flanders Field. But Andy Razoff also did, there we are, okay? That's good that we have that. So in Flanders Field, we can see these crosses, the victims or the dead. There's the 15th and there's the 70th, and also there's something known as the Graves Registration Service. Has anybody ever heard of that? Well, this was mostly made up of black soldiers who were responsible for disinterring the dead where they were buried on, the spot, to move them to identify them and to move them to American graveyards in France, or to prepare them for being sent home. It was, really difficult work, to say the least, but that's one of the jobs that blacks had. So he also represents that. But he wrote a poem called Don't Tread on Me, which invokes the rattlesnake and the 369th as well. There we have Benjamin O. Davis Sr. up there, who I said was the first black commander. The second was Chauncey Hooper. I consider him to be the first, really, because he was a member of the regiment during World War I. He was a sergeant and stayed with the regiment until World War II, and in 1940 became the commander of the unit. One of the things I didn't say is that there was this fear about these soldiers after the war. The War Department basically eliminates the Black National Guard combat units after the war, and the 369th is among them. There's no more 369th after the war. What there is left is a 15th New York Guard, which is strictly domestic. It was put in place when the soldiers were away. It was to guard the state of New York. That 15th New York Guard served as a nucleus for what would become the reorganized 369th Regiment, which happened in 1922, recognized in 1924. Arthur W. Little, who wrote the book From Harlem to the Rhine, would be its commander. And one of the things that he did was basically remove all the black officers who were in that unit in 1922. And once again, it's not until 1938 that it gets its first black commander. I think I should end there. I'm willing to take any questions that you have. I thank you for your rapt attention, and I hope you see this as having been a worthwhile experience. Thank you very much. Oh, two things. This event is in part sponsored by Gilder Lehrman. Gilder Lehrman has a publication called History Now, and There's an article that I wrote on the 15th New York 369th Regiment in the fall 2016 issue of History Now, which you can find online. Eileen, what is the name of that primary documents collection? It's American World War I or something that's also a Gilder Lehrman publication. And of course, two of the most famous documents are W.E.B. Du Bois' Close Ranks and his return fighting. All right, thank you. I'll take any questions that you have.